Almost 100 days have passed since that silent day in September that marked an irreversible turning point. Time, to all appearances, has fulfilled its usual function. Official statements were issued, procedures were closed, and the institutional world moved on to the next headline. However, outside of that orderly framework, something very different has been occurring. Collective memory has not followed the same rhythm. Far from dissipating, the figure of Yu Menglong has begun to reappear with unexpected intensity, as if his absence had opened more questions than answers. In several regions of Asia, from Taiwan to Thailand and Malaysia, spontaneous commemoration ceremonies emerged for the 100 days since his departure. These were not events coordinated by any central organization nor promoted by official entities. They were gatherings driven by ordinary people, brought together by a shared sense of unease. In those vigils, amidst flowers, photographs, and prayers, not only was grief expressed, a silent resistance was also manifested, a refusal to accept that everything had ended so simply. In many cultural traditions, the 100th day represents a symbolic threshold. It is the moment when weeping should cease and the living should continue their path. But in this case, that milestone did not mark a closure. Rather, it functioned as a trigger. From that point on, details began to emerge that had gone unnoticed, scattered fragments that, when observed closely, acquired a disturbing weight. A word pronounced differently in a song. A gesture interrupted in public. A dark image that generated contradictory interpretations. Each element, on its own, might seem irrelevant. Together, they began to form a pattern that many could not ignore. This analysis does not start from an accusation or a predetermined conclusion. It starts from a fundamental question. To what extent does an individual, even one surrounded by fame and recognition, retain real control over their own life within a highly structured system? The world of entertainment is often presented as a space of opportunity, visibility, and success. However, behind that shiny surface, there exist complex power relations, asymmetrical contracts, and dynamics that are rarely discussed out loud. In recent days, the debate has transcended borders and platforms. International petitions, conversations in forums, and comparisons with other past cases do not seek to replace formal justice, but they do evidence a profound mistrust in closed narratives. When a story is closed too quickly, society tends to review what was left outside the frame. But behind the glamour and the official explanations, what mechanisms actually operate in these truncated trajectories throughout this analysis, the indications, contexts, and structures that surrounded Yu Menglong will be examined, not to pass a sentence, but to understand how a system works that on occasions seems to demand silence in exchange for belonging. The unease did not arise from a single event, but from a slow and persistent accumulation of details that, with the passage of time, began to acquire a different meaning. At the center of this first layer of analysis lies an apparently insignificant element, a musical interpretation. For years, the song Encounter was considered a nostalgic piece, charged with melancholy but foreign to any extraordinary reading. However, following the disappearance of Yu Menglong, that recording was revisited with almost surgical attention. Some listeners noticed a subtle variation in a key line. It was not an evident alteration, nor a change that could be perceived by the naked ear. It was a minimal difference in pronunciation, a phonetic nuance that only emerged after multiple listens. From a linguistic perspective, the similarity between the sounds made an involuntary error plausible. From an emotional perspective, however, that variation began to feel like something different. The phrase, upon being reinterpreted, ceased to express an abstract resignation and instead insinuated a personal impossibility, a lack of control that went beyond chance. This phenomenon reveals something essential about the relationship between the public and public figures. When a story remains open, every past gesture becomes a potential archive. Not because it necessarily contains a hidden truth, but because the absence of answers generates a void that the collective mind attempts to fill. In this case, the reading of the song was not imposed by a single influential voice, but constructed by thousands of listeners who shared a common sense of disquiet. To this musical interpretation were added concrete images. A video recorded in a daily context showed Yu Menglong signing autographs for followers. The scene, which in any other circumstance would have been routine, acquired a different tone when observed closely. In the recording, one can perceive how his arm is held firmly by a person beside him, apparently to interrupt contact with the public. The gesture lasts barely a few seconds, but its impact is lasting. The artist's expression is not one of rebellion or open surprise, but of containment. That containment, precisely, was what many interpreted as a sign of the normalization of control. From the point of view of professional protocol, the presence of supervision is not unusual. Representatives and managers usually regulate timing and interactions. However, what awakened unease was not the intervention itself, but the manner. The rigidity of the movement, the lack of visible dialogue, and the immediate reaction of the artist generated the impression of an unbalanced relationship. For a part of the public, that instant encapsulated a disturbing idea, that of a recognized figure who had to measure every action, even those intended to express gratitude. The third element that fed this perception was an image disseminated online, popularly known for its association with a specific artistic space. The photograph presents a dark composition, with an oppressive atmosphere that contrasts with the habitual aesthetic of artistic promotion. In it appears a figure seated in a black chair, with postures that suggest restriction. Other presences, partially visible, intensify the sensation of discomfort. From an objective analysis, the image could be interpreted as a conceptual work designed to provoke and challenge. There is no official confirmation of its context or its original purpose. Nevertheless, in a climate of suspicion, images cease to be neutral. The photograph was read by many as a symbolic representation of subjugation. The lack of clear information allowed the collective imagination to project existing tensions onto it. Here, a recurring pattern in similar cases manifests. When transparency fails, even art becomes potential testimony. These three elements, considered in isolation, do not constitute conclusive evidence of any kind. They do not prove hidden intentions, nor confirm specific narratives. However, their strength resides in the emotional coherence they generate when observed together. They all point toward the same sensation, that of an individual who might not have possessed full autonomy in certain aspects of his professional life. The question that arises then is not whether every detail is true or verifiable, But why so many observers reached similar conclusions without prior coordination? The answer may be found in the shared experience of those who know the dynamics of contemporary entertainment. Extensive contracts, restrictive clauses, and rigid hierarchies are documented realities. In that context, the idea of constant pressure ceases to seem implausible. Upon finalizing this first phase of the analysis, an accusation is not established, but rather a realization. There exist indications that, at the very least, justify the persistent discomfort of the public. The story of Yu Menglong, as it has been perceived, has become a mirror of broader fears regarding the loss of individual control within highly concentrated systems. And in the face of this accumulation of signals, an inevitable question arises for one who observes from the outside. If these gestures were interpreted as silent calls, what responsibility does society bear when it decides to ignore them? What do you think of this? You can share your reflection, because this analysis remains open and is also built from the gazes of those who observe with attention. Public attention did not take long to intensify. As the scattered fragments began to circulate with greater frequency, the conversation ceased to be intimate and transformed into a collective phenomenon. What was initially an exchange between followers turned into a media avalanche that transcended platforms and borders. International petitions began to gather signatures steadily, and every new testimony, every comment rescued from the past, fed a shared sense of urgency. For many observers, this growth did not reflect only curiosity, but a need to restore a balance they perceived as broken. The response to this wave of attention was deeply polarized. On one hand, a group emerged convinced that the indications pointed to a pattern of systematic control, a structure that severely limited the artist's autonomy. For these people, the accumulation of silences and inexplicable decisions could only be understood as the result of an unequal power dynamic. On the other hand, voices also appeared, warning of the risk of turning emotional interpretations into categorical affirmations. They pointed out the absence of conclusive proof and defended the need for prudence, reminding that the entertainment industry is, by nature, a complex and highly regulated environment. In the center of this debate lies the professional trajectory of Yu Menglong, whose evolution began to be reviewed with a retrospective perspective. His debut was marked by rapid public exposure and a long-term contract that defined the early years of his career. These types of agreements, common in the sector, usually grant agencies considerable control over the agenda, image, and projects of the artists. For a time, this model seemed to work without visible friction. However, with the passage of years, tensions began to be perceived. A key moment was the attempt to modify his contractual relationship before the original agreement reached its term. This gesture, interpreted by some as a legitimate search for greater autonomy, did not produce the expected result. The consequences did not manifest immediately or explicitly. There were no public statements or detailed explanations. What followed was a period of notable reduction in media presence, a prolonged absence that many described as a professional freeze. During those years, opportunities seemed to dilute, and his name gradually disappeared from projects that, by profile and experience, would have been coherent with his career. When he finally reappeared under the management of a new company, the return was received with renewed expectations. However, That transition was also the subject of analysis. Investigations conducted by attentive users revealed corporate links between the different entities involved, suggesting the existence of a broader corporate web. From a strictly factual perspective, these connections do not automatically imply an intention of continuous control. Cross-participation structures are common in concentrated industries. Nevertheless, for an audience already sensitized, these relationships reinforced the perception that the change had been more apparent than real. The indirect testimony of professionals in the sector added another layer of complexity. Comments attributed to people with experience in content production described a scenario in which the lack of promotion did not respond to an absence of talent, but to internal strategic decisions. According to these versions, an artist's visibility does not always depend on their capacity or reception by the public, but on corporate priorities that may vary without external explanation. In this context, the notion of merit becomes subordinated to criteria that are rarely made transparent. This point is fundamental to understanding the public's emotional reaction. The indignation was not directed solely at a specific company or contract, but at a system that seems to operate under rules inaccessible to those outside of it. The idea that a career can be slowed down or diverted for reasons unrelated to artistic performance proves deeply disturbing. For many, this possibility questions the meritocratic narrative that sustains much of the attraction of entertainment. As the discussion advanced, it became evident that Yu Menglong's case functioned as a catalyst for broader concerns. It was not just about an individual, but about what he represented. The media avalanche reflected a growing distrust toward the structures of concentrated power and a sense of helplessness in the face of decisions made in opaque spheres. In this scenario, every new piece of data, confirmed or not, was interpreted in the light of a pre-existing suspicion. It is important to underscore that this analysis does not seek to establish culprits nor simplify a complex reality. The entertainment industry is composed of multiple levels of negotiation, economic interests, and cultural dynamics. However, the persistence of the debate indicates that there is a gap between formal explanations and the experience perceived by the public. When that gap widens, the official narrative loses efficacy, and the audience seeks meaning in other sources. At the close of this second phase, the panorama that emerges is that of a silent confrontation between two forces. On one side, the institutional structures that operate with discretion and continuity. On the other, a public opinion that, even without access to all the data, resists accepting quick conclusions. In that tension, the core of the conflict is defined, not the certainty of an abuse, but the impossibility of dispelling the doubt. And while that doubt remains, the story continues moving toward an inevitable point of comparison, where another name, another interrupted trajectory begins to resonate with a disturbingly similar force. The convergence of two names in the same space of memory is rarely a casual act. When, in a ceremony held in Malaysia, the tributes included both Yu Menglong and Chow Renliang, many observers perceived the gesture charged with meaning. It was not about establishing a direct equivalence, nor affirming an immediate causal relationship, but about recognizing an emotional resonance that had been growing over time. Two distinct trajectories, two different personal contexts, but a shared sensation of abrupt interruption that the official discourse never finished clarifying. At this point in the analysis, attention shifted toward symbolic parallels. Fragments of past interviews, artistic images, and apparently innocuous expressions began to be reinterpreted under a new light. In the case of Chao Renliang, some audiovisual records showed comments that, at the time, were received as simple jokes or metaphors, without major transcendence. With the passage of time, those words acquired a different nuance. The collective mind, faced with the repetition of tragic endings, began to look for patterns where before it only saw coincidences. One of the most discussed elements was the recurrent use of certain visual symbols in artistic productions and personal publications. Drawings, specific colors, and animal figures became objects of detailed analysis. From a rational perspective, these symbols can be understood as aesthetic choices or subjective expressions without a predefined hidden meaning. Art by nature is ambiguous and open to multiple interpretations. However, when these representations are observed after a tragedy, their ambiguity transforms into fertile ground for speculation. This phenomenon is not new. Throughout history, societies have resorted to symbols to process events that exceed their capacity for immediate understanding. When formal mechanisms of explanation prove insufficient or inaccessible, symbolic thought emerges as an alternative way to grant meaning. In the context of these two stories, the recurrence of certain images was interpreted by some as a form of indirect communication, a way to express what could not be said openly. The comparison between Yu Menglong and Chao Renliang also highlighted a fundamental psychological aspect: the need for narrative continuity. For the public, accepting that two painful outcomes lack any structural connection can result more disturbing than assuming the existence of a pattern. The pattern, even when not proven, offers an illusion of order. It allows one to think that there is an underlying logic, however dark it may be, instead of facing the idea that chance and human fragility can produce devastating consequences without any explanation. To this symbolic dimension was added the appearance of interpretations of a spiritual or mystical character. Some voices claimed to perceive a persistent influence of those who are no longer here, a sort of echo that would continue pressing upon those who remain in the system. From a verifiable point of view, these assertions cannot be confirmed nor refuted with objective data. Nevertheless, their popularity reveals a collective emotional state marked by frustration. When formal justice seems distant or ineffective, people tend to seek solace in narratives that promise an alternative form of balance. This recourse to the spiritual should not be understood as proof of credulity, but as a symptom. It indicates a loss of confidence in traditional channels of resolution and a sense of impotence in the face of structures perceived as immovable. In that void, even the most abstract hypotheses acquire symbolic value, not for their empirical veracity, but for their capacity to offer an emotional response. The darkest moment of this narrative convergence is found in the reflection on isolation. Both in the case of Yu Menglong and in that of Chao Renliang, many followers expressed the impression that, despite the fame and recognition, there existed a deep loneliness. The public image of success contrasts with the possibility of an inner life marked by constant pressure, surveillance, and the impossibility of freely deciding. This dissonance is one of the most disturbing aspects of the account, because it challenges the assumption that visibility guarantees protection. At this point, the analysis reaches its emotional climax. Not because a definitive truth is revealed, but because a question is exposed that admits no simple answer. What happens when a system designed to produce entertainment ends up eroding the autonomy of those who sustain it? The lack of a clear conclusion is not a weakness of the account, but its most honest core. It recognizes the limits of available knowledge and, at the same time, underscores the gravity of the concerns raised. The story, upon arriving here, ceases to be solely about two individuals. It transforms into a broader reflection on the conditions in which fame is built and the human cost it may imply. The public, in establishing these connections, does not necessarily seek concrete culprits. It seeks coherence, transparency, and above all, the guarantee that the lives behind the spectacle are not treated as expendable elements. With this convergence of symbols, emotions, and comparisons, the most intense phase of the analysis closes. What remains is not a certainty, but an expanded consciousness. And it is precisely from that consciousness that it becomes possible to look forward and ask what lessons can be extracted from stories that, even without being fully resolved, refuse to be forgotten. Upon reaching the end of this journey, it becomes evident that the story of Yu Menglong cannot be reduced to a closed chronology or a single explanation. What remains is not a definitive sentence, but a series of questions that continue to resonate with force. Beyond the official statements and administrative procedures, there exists a human dimension that resists being archived. That dimension is what keeps the conversation alive and explains why, even with the passage of time, interest does not dissolve. The case has functioned as an uncomfortable mirror. It not only reflects the trajectory of an artist whose life was interrupted, but it exposes the structural tensions of an industry that usually operates far from public scrutiny. Fame, often presented as a synonym for privilege and freedom, appears here accompanied by limits, pressures, and decisions made in closed spaces. This contradiction forces a rethinking of the idealized image of success and a recognition that visibility does not always protect those who inhabit it. The persistence of collective memory reveals a central lesson. Forgetting is not automatic, nor should it be. Remembering does not imply accusing without foundation, but refusing to accept that administrative speed substitutes deep understanding. In this sense, the sustained attention of the public becomes a form of ethical vigilance. It does not guarantee immediate justice, but it does establish a symbolic limit against indifference. From this story emerges a broader reflection on the fragility of individuals within highly hierarchized systems. When power is concentrated and decision-making mechanisms become opaque, the sensation of defenselessness is amplified. The experience of Yu Menglong, interpreted through multiple gazes, highlights the need for greater transparency, for more balanced contractual frameworks, and for spaces where the personal voice is not diluted by superior interests. The learning is not restricted to the realm of entertainment. It speaks of a contemporary condition in which the public image can hide profound vulnerabilities. It also reminds us that responsibility does not fall solely on institutions. Society, as an audience and as a community, plays a fundamental role by questioning, observing, and demanding clarity. Collective silence, when it is imposed, favors the repetition of dynamics that erode human dignity. Looking toward the future, it is likely that many of the questions raised will not find immediate answers. However, the absence of definitive conclusions does not invalidate the process. On the contrary, it underscores the importance of keeping difficult conversations open. The story of Yu Menglong does not close with a full stop, but with an implicit warning about the invisible costs of success and the need to protect the people behind the spectacle. Ultimately, remembering is an act of responsibility. As long as memory exists, there also exists the possibility of change. And although the complete truth may take time to emerge, the simple fact of not forgetting already constitutes a form of resistance against the darkness of what is left unsaid.